I don't know of, I haven't done any work with commercial vermicomposting, is what worm composting is called, and I have a lot of experience with it in the U.S. and it is wonderful, and I have a lot of firsthand experience using it in my own gardens. Worm castings are worm excrement, but a lot of vermicompost is great because the worms are able to consume and excrete the material that's being broken down in a different way than the microbes and the insects can. What I always loved vermicompost or worm castings is it was a very gentle supply of nitrogen. Depending on what the worms were breaking down, there could be any number. Like it's a mixed bag. Like if you put in high nitrogen and phosphorus materials to be composted and broken down by the worms, then high nitrogen and phosphorus material come out. But all the vermicompost I worked with in the U.S. that was sold commercially had a 0.5 nitrogen value, which is like significant. I mean, it's something. But it's about the same actually as human urine. So it's like it's enough that plants will take that nitrogen up and respond to it, but it's not enough nitrogen for a heavy demand nitrogen crop like maize. But for a home garden that already has plenty of nutrients in it that have been cycling around and building up for years and years, worm castings are a great addition. There's no harm, and there's a small nitrogen addition. I love them. Not far from Cornell, there was a commercial vermicomposting facility, which was just awesome. It was this big factory that was just full of like enormous metal bins full of worms that were like breaking down like commercial like dump trucks loads full of compostable material, and I thought it was just the coolest like mix of like just inherent knowledge that's been passed down through like hundreds of generations of people and like high technology, making it widely available. I really hoped that it would take off more, but it seems to be. It doesn't seem to have gone widespread among society yet.
It's going pretty widespread this time.
I imagine. I hope I'm not telling people stuff that everybody already knows. But yeah, worms are great. My grandmother, who gave me that first edition of the Encyclopedia of Organic Gardening, starting in the 1950s, when she started getting stuff from the Rodale Institute, guides, she had a big vermicompost bin the size of this table in the basement, and all the food scraps went in there, and along with some soil and worms from the garden, and they'd be in there, all winter long, and then it'd get emptied out every season or so, and it was like some of my mom's earliest memories were taking the food scraps down to the basement to feed the worms. And I encourage anyone who has space to do vermicomposting. You can do it in like a plastic tote or anything. Conventional chemical fertilizers are known to accelerate the loss of soil carbon and the loss of beneficial soil microbes that require carbon to live. And you may have heard of something called the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Now, carbon to nitrogen ratio is exactly why this top point is a fact. When just nitrogen by itself, which is only available in the chemical forms. There's no purified organic nitrogen that's just nitrogen. There's always other stuff in there. But if you give just nitrogen to the soil, the microbes in that soil need, just like in a compost pile, those microbes need a certain balance or ratio of carbon to nitrogen. So for every gram or milligram of carbon that those microbes can eat, they need a certain amount of nitrogen to go with it. And if you're only adding nitrogen to the soil as a chemical, then what you're doing is mining the carbon that's already in that soil, because the microbes are eating that carbon that's already there and releasing it as gases out to the environment. So it's very important to keep track of the carbon content and top it up when needed, because there's compost, there's biochar, there's cover crops, there's all sorts of stuff that can be added to the soil to increase carbon content. Another good strategy is giving that plot of land a season off or a year off to and just grow a plant there and till it in afterwards and not harvest it. This is something I'm sure everyone in the room has probably seen, but I think it's just worth considering, like, what is soil health, and it's all three of these things. It's the physical, the chemical, and the biological, and no one is more important than the others because they're all essential. And when I say chemical, I mean chemical in the broad sense of chemistry, not chemical fertilizers. So soil health exists in that nexus where the physical, chemical, and biological are all optimal. So soil is made from mineral and biological components that affect the structure of soil. It's weathered rocks, and it's microbes and rotting plant material and rotting microbes that make something soil as opposed to just sand or pure silt or something like that. Conventional fertilizers harm the biology of soil by creating the imbalance that I just... So here's another diagram some of you have probably seen before. It shows the different components of a biologically healthy soil. It starts with plants with healthy roots and sufficient organic matter, synonymous with carbon in the soil, and then that supports the beneficial fungi and bacteria, along with nematodes. Nematodes are these worm-like microbes in soil that sometimes get a bad name because, like bacteria, some of them are pathogens, but most of them are not, and some of them are really are indicators of healthy things going on. But another thing I encourage anyone who's interested to Google pictures of nematodes they're beautiful. The biggest nematodes are like 2 centimeters long, I think. And the smallest ones are, barely visible with the naked eye or not at all. But when you look at them under a microscope, they look like monsters from, like, if you've seen the movie Dune, like giant sandworms. Like they're just like so many soil microbes. They're beautifully terrifying, scaled up. And that goes for like the arthropods, which are like they're described as shredders and predators because some of them are eating rotting plant material and breaking it all apart, and other arthropods are carnivorous and eating other bugs. And it's a whole in a handful of healthy soil. There are more living organisms than there are human beings on Earth in one handful of soil. And that's not like, some magic soil that I saw once. That's a blanket statement that's true across the board. I mean, it took me a while in my career to really wrap my head around it, that in that handful of soil, it's a whole ecosystem, or even more than that. It's many different ecosystems within there, and all these different, like every one of these types of organisms, there's all different species, and they each have a biological niche that is something that they do, and they're dependent on each other. So nurturing this, like the cycle of life inside the soil, is really key to having a soil that's productive. This is a diagram that I made in PowerPoint, and it just shows what I was talking. It shows visually what I was talking about earlier with the mycorrhizal fungi extending the plant roots. So this is a very magnified plant root, and this is the channel of the middle of the root that the water and nutrients travel up through. And these are the fine root hairs that you can see when you look at a root really closely. And those root hairs are what pull the nutrients into the root and then ultimately up into the plant. And the mycorrhizae attach to those fine root hairs and then come all the way out, 10 times as far away or more, and bring those nutrients in. Just a term I should have introduced earlier, rhizosphere. One of my favorite words is actually the name of my old dog as well. Yeah, rhizo for short. So the rhizosphere is, there are two types of soil, biologically or physically. You've got what's called bulk soil, which is all the soil that's not shown in this diagram, and then there's the rhizosphere, which is the sphere of soil around a living root. And that's important because that rhizosphere is where all this life is happening. That's where the microbes are. That's where they're thriving. That's where their life cycles are happening. In the bulk soil, away from the rhizosphere, so bulk soil over here or over here, or down here, that soil is comparatively devoid of life. Because it's sort of like, in our context, it would be like a desert to them. There's no, if there's no plant roots in there, there's no, if there's no plant roots or material breaking or rotting material, there's nothing for the microbes to live on, and so they gravitate towards where life is easy, and that is the rhizosphere. Here's another example of what mycorrhizae do, and this data I selected from some of the scientific work of Clive Sinclair, the late founder of Pacific Biofert. They did this work where they measured the phosphorus concentration in the plant. Some of the plants inoculated with mycorrhizae, and other plants not. This graph over here has added phosphorus. And you can see that there's more phosphorus that ends up in the plant with mycorrhizae present, regardless of how much phosphorus is added. And this ties into another issue that is important in New Zealand, which is excessive applications of phosphorus. Because there's so much phosphorus in New Zealand that's just chemically locked up in the soil because of pH or because of other factors, and that it can be released and made available again. And that's information that should be available to every farmer when they get their soil tested. But it seems to get lost somewhere along the way, chemical fertilizer company is doing the testing and telling the farmer how to interpret the results. There needs to, in order for effective change to happen, I think there needs to be an impartial third party to give truthful advice where they're not profiting one way or the other. Covered everything in this slide already except intensive tillage, so plowing, turning the soil over, or even taking a hoe out to your garden and breaking up the soil with that. Anything that exposes, any mechanical means that exposes the soil to the air, and uncovers it, is tillage. And intensive tillage are things like moldboard plowing, like the big plow that gets pulled behind a tractor that actually has those blades that flip the soil over. There are usually a whole bunch of them together, but it can be very damaging to the soil if carbon content is not watched. I think it's perfectly fine, and it's an essential part of weed control for a lot of farmers, to do tillage so they don't have to spray, they just bury weeds. But every time you even stick a blade into the soil and introduce oxygen in there that wasn't there before, the microbes go into hyperdrive and they start just eating up all that carbon and releasing it as CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So intensive tillage is something that it's for decades, it's been an enormous problem in Prt02. That's where I did a 2-year biochar field trial when I first moved here, and I really liked the Prt02 area. It's, just all agriculture. It was great getting to know farmers down there. But some of the stories that I heard were incredibly alarming. Like erosion so bad that it closed roads because cars couldn't get through. This much soil this deep that it washed off of fields across roads. And before I moved here, I read a paper that was published in 2002 by some real prominent New Zealand soil scientists that said that many places in Prt02 that are intensively farmed now, the topsoil there that's on the top now used to be subsoil just a few decades ago. And subsoil, in case you've never dug down that far, subsoil is like that gravelly, it looks like stuff that, after a few thousand years of erosion and natural processes, it could become soil. But it lacks the carbon and the texture qualities that good topsoil has. So in Prt02, in these places where the organic matter has declined so much and so much erosion has happened, those soils, because they can't hold the nutrients in the soil very long, they require more fertilizer because the fertilizer is not used as efficiently. More of it's lost, so more of it needs to be added so that the plants can get it. But then that gets lost, and more has to be added. And it's a vicious cycle that leads to deserts if the issues aren't addressed. And it's really not. I say this having spent the last 21 years of my life focused on nothing but soil and water and agriculture, but it's really not that. Soil conservation and just maintenance isn't that difficult of a concept. Soils need maintenance like any other thing that we use needs maintenance and care. And I'm optimistic that things can change for the better, and a big part of what drew me to New Zealand is a can-do attitude of trying new things and new approaches to solve problems.